This is the UC Davis MedSci NMR facility overview. In this video, we'll be going over the following things: accessing the MedSci facility, the NMR instruments specifically at the MedSci facility, some complementary features to the instruments, as well as some past research experience from chemistry graduate students, and lastly, acknowledgments. Getting to MedSci from chemistry can be shown here on this Google Maps screenshot indicated by the blue path. Typically, students have used their bikes to get over to the MedSci facility, but alternatively, there's also parking close by, so you can drive over there if needed. It's always important to consult chemical safety and NMR staff on the transportation of samples if you have any questions, or if you're in a research group, you can always talk to your fellow lab mates and ask them if they have used the facility, how they do so. With is a 500 megahertz variable temperature liquids NMR. Located in MedSci, it's equipped with a broadband probe that's tunable from 15 nitrogen all the way to phosphorus 31. And additional probes are available upon request with the NMR staff. Now, with this instrument, there is a module attached to the back of it that allows you to vary the temperature between minus 100 to 150 degrees Celsius, either through liquid nitrogen or an external cooling unit that does not require that liquid nitrogen. Keep in mind that if you want to reach lower temperatures, you will need to go to the liquid nitrogen setup, and that can be supplied by the NMR staff for a price, or you can bring your own liquid nitrogen in. And so the software for this instrument is Topspin 1.3 running on Linux. And in terms of relatable software in Chemistry 93, the Topspin software that you're learning with the 400 megahertz is related, although this is a slightly older version. Next instrument I'll talk about is the 800 megahertz Bruker instrument located at MedSci. Now, this instrument is equipped with a cryoprobe for liquids, which allows for up to 4-to-1 signal-to-noise enhancement compared to the standard probe. Additionally, this can switch out with solid-state probes, which the NMR staff replace at regular intervals, and you can always talk to them as to when a certain probe will be in the 800, because the 800 is capable of both solid-state and solution phase NMR, and there are implications for both as to the type of equipment used to acquire those data. Additionally, this is capable of varied temperature, albeit a smaller range than, say, the 500 megahertz from 0 to 50 degrees centigrade, but isn't useful for, say, biological samples. The software is an updated version of Topspin running on Windows 7, and this instrument is ideal for extremely dilute organic samples. You can imagine single-digit milligram quantities or even less, or studying biomolecules where you have a lot of active nuclei present, and so you need that high level of resolution in order to distinguish your signals. We have a Bruker 600 megahertz high throughput NMR, which is equipped with a TCI cryoprobe that allows for 4-to-1 signal-to-noise enhancement for typical nuclei like proton, carbon, nitrogen-15, deuterium, as well as an airjet sample changer. So similar to the 400, this instrument is automated, so you could bring several samples over and it could do them without you having to be there. Additionally, this instrument is capable of variable temperature from 0 to 50 C, so that's relevant for, say, biological systems or slightly cooler systems. And it's equipped with Topspin 3.2 on Windows 7, and the automated feature runs on a software called Icon NMR. And so typically a 600 megahertz is ideal for dilute organic samples, or if you want to get characterization done super quickly, as well as some high throughput analysis. Megahertz solid state and variable temp instrument, which has the possibility of 4 different probes and tunable to a variety of nuclei, which you can always consult the NMR staff for the choice of probe depending on what you're trying to do. Given this instrument does solid state NMR, it's also capable of magic angle spinning up to 35 kilohertz, which is a means to reduce the number of artifacts in solid state NMR. And with this instrument, it has a very large VT window of minus 150 to 400 degrees Celsius. So this is definitely the instrument to do higher temp experiments in the solid state. And here, the software is topspin derivative on Windows XP. And like stated at the bottom, solid state experiments at varied temperature are ideal for this instrument. And lastly, one of the more interesting NMRs at MedSci is this 400 megahertz high pressure NMR. And it's able to have a variety of different probes attached to it. So that means you can sense just about any nuclei. And again, just consult the NMR staff for the choice. And this unit allows for up to 20 kilobars of pressure, so very, very high pressure systems, which may be relevant, say, in under geothermal conditions. And the software is Topspin 1.3 on Linux. And again, this is ideal for NMR experiments at high pressure. One of the exciting complementary features of MedSci is that there's a fume hood located walking distance from most of the instruments. And this is ideal for if you have samples that need to be prepared and experiments need to be run on them really quickly, if you are running a reaction and you're taking out aliquots, or if you're perhaps doing surgery on even a live animal, because the facility is also used for MRI. Keep in mind that the fume hood area does need to be rented, which costs money, and you need to contact the NMR staff for pricing and availability. But that is something that this facility has that Chemistry 93 doesn't have, since we don't allow any sample preparation or open chemicals in Chemistry 93. Now, let's get into some past research experience for some chemistry graduate students. Starting off with a variable temperature study from the Power Lab, this vanadium complex was studied under a variety of temperatures and was shown to transition between the intermediate on the left and would switch to the intermediate on the right as a function of temperature. And this was relevant as a means of characterizing that complex and really documenting the transfer of the trimethylsilyl group as a function of temperature. And the graduate student who worked on this project noted that frankly, none of the magnets in the chemistry building are equipped for variable temperature, so heading off to MedSci was frankly essential. But on top of that, the instruments in chemistry are typically being used by several people throughout the day, and the number of scans required for this study was pretty large. It was several hours worth of acquisition, especially with the temperature changing. So if you ever need to sit down at an instrument for a long, extended period of time, and you want to have a very good chance of getting that scheduled, you could consider going over to MedSci as it's typically used less. Here we have another example of the 500 megahertz liquids instrument from the Power Lab, and here they're doing an example of vanadium 51 NMR. Now, you probably haven't really heard of vanadium 51 NMR, and that's because it's not really commonly done, but that's why the 500 megahertz is an ideal instrument for this type of nucleus. So not only was the Power Lab doing variable temperature work, but they were also studying a nucleus that, frankly, was uncommon, and the fact that the 500 megahertz had the capabilities of both a broadband probe and VT allowed them to collect vanadium NMR at varied temperature. Now, interestingly about vanadium NMR, even though the spin is 7/2, meaning that it's quadrupolar, the overall line broadening, because of that quadrupolar effect, is not that strong. So you actually can get reasonable peak widths out. Another interesting find that they found from this is, or not specifically from this, but that they observed, was something called inverse electronegativity dependence, where in the case of more electronegative atoms being attached to the vanadium, it's actually moving upfield instead of your conventional downfield. And I have the reference down at the corner if anyone is interested in further information. Here we have an example of the 800 megahertz from the Murray Lab in understanding protein dynamics. Now, some features about solid-state protein NMR can be found on the left, and what's fairly useful about using solid state NMR on proteins is that there's no longer a need for solvents. So there's no longer a need to be soluble. And one of the interesting features too about protein NMR is that in order to increase the sensitivity of and increase the amount of signal, they'll often dope their organisms that are forming these proteins with carbon-13, nitrogen-15, or even deuterium in order to enhance the level of sensitivity. And again, the experiments that they can use include 3D cross-polarization, which again goes beyond the scope of this class, but this just goes to show that when you start studying such complicated molecules, you need a high-level instrument in order to enable proper resolution and assigned the structure. So here we have RJ, a fourth year in the Olson lab, and he's going to talk about some NMR usage in MedSci. So RJ, can you briefly describe what the project you did was and what NMR experiments you were doing?
Sure. So I make photoswitchable compounds that can isomerize between cis and trans isomers with different wavelengths of light. So to measure the extent to which these things isomerize, we use NMR. And you can see here some NMR samples with a long fiber optic cable. And we feed that fiber optic cable into the sample and actually feed that whole cable directly into the 800 megahertz instrument at MedSci. And by switching between these different lights, you can see the peaks, the proton peaks building in and phasing out depending if there is a cis or trans isomer present. Oh, and the reason why the MedSci facility is so useful is just these compounds, since they absorb so much light, we want to make sure that the light homogeneously penetrates our sample. And to ensure that, we have to run these samples extremely dilute. And the cryoprobes over at MedSci allow us to run very dilute samples in shorter amounts of time, as well as sometimes these isomers do not have great resolution for different proton peaks. So the increased resolution from the high field magnet of the 800 megahertz instrument really allows us to see slight nuances in chemical shifts.
Great. How would you describe the assistance that you've had with the NMR staff when it came to troubleshooting or designing experiments?
The staff is phenomenal. Jeff and Ping really do treat these instruments like they're their baby. They really help me tailor the experiments to accommodate this photo switchable probe that I installed. You need to make sure there's no like torsional strain on the NMR sample from the fiber optic. So Jeff allowed me to make a pulley going over the NMR to feed my fiber optic through, so it was only coming down, vertically instead of pulling on the sample. And they also allowed me to not eject and inject with air. I can actually like feed it down with the cable.
Oh, wow. Great. And then lastly, just to wrap up, what advice would you give to Chemistry 219 lab students about the NMR facilities in terms of applying it to their research in the future?
I think using the MedSci facilities in particular are super useful because often you'll have things with terrible resolution where different peaks are overlapping, and using these high field magnets really let you tease that apart. I have a very specialized case with these photo switches, but one of my lab mates had one not enough carbon NMR peaks for his publication, and he needed to identify that last peak. So we ran his sample on the 800 megahertz NMR, and it resolved the issue, and we had the correct amount of carbons, and it really clarified that discrepancy. Anytime you need to run anything dilute or super complex like a protein, these magnets allow for you to take your sample and get your data within a feasible amount of time.
Now that you've seen some examples of research done in the MedSci facility and what the potential benefits of using that facility are, I wanted to round off this talk with some advice from chemistry graduate students that have used the facility that I collected feedback from. Feel free to pause this video and read as you wish. Lastly, I want to say thank you to Dr. Jeff Walton, Dr. Ping Yu, Carrie Stennett, RJ Tambari, Coyle Munson and Blake Fonda for help making this video.